Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this video where I'm going to be talking about something that's interested me for a long time. If I were to call myself an economist, which I do very infrequently, I do. Yeah, I have relevant qualifications. My master's was a behavioural economic piece, for which I got a distinction. Don't know why I did that. So, but if I were to describe myself as an economist, it would certainly be a behavioural economist. I think classical economics works to an extent. It works if the world is functioning according to the classic economic paradigm, but when the world doesn't function that way, it all breaks down. So it's good at sort of setting a vague rule set for solving the problem of valuation most of the time, but sometimes it just doesn't apply. What always applies is behavioural economics. However, you can't really model in any kind of fixed manner. Anyway, I'm waffling again. Let's get on with the... I've done a presentation. It's not working. No, here it is. So this video is called Bias and Balance. So we're going to be talking about how Warhammer players... don't worry, I'm not going to read the slides, but I'm going to read the title. Designers and spectators all misread the meta, because how everybody understands what the meta is different. People, there are local metas, there are national metas, there's the international meta, which is different again from local metas. We'll have a look at some actual data when I've done the presentation, and sort of show that. So essentially, when we talk about the meta, that's a very, very nebulous term. Really, what the point of that is to essentially highlight the factions that are doing better, so that can be your next pick in terms of picking something to go to tournament. Because if factions are better, which is why if you're like a competitive tournament player, you need lots of armies. So for instance, I've got Lizardmen, Warriors of Chaos, Khemri, Vampire Counts, Ogres. What else have I got good to go? I've got a Tzeentch Demon list. I'm restarting, I guess, Skaven. So you need like a variety of... I do need some elves. I'd like some dark elves. But anyway, you do need a variety of factions so that when the meta shifts, you can take advantage of it and, be good in the new meta. Either that, or you can pick a faction that can do that because it's got all the things like internally. So classically, Empire have always been really good at that. Like if you want to just collect one army that always functions regardless of the meta, you go Empire, because if you want to go for a big Empire army, you can build like a 2,000 point knightly list. You can build a 2,000 point artillery heavy list, and then you can build a 2,000 point infantry heavy list, right? And then you finish up with about 6,000 points of troops, but you've got an Empire army that can do all the jobs, right? And then you've got the flexibility because you've got all those models to sort of mix and match within like a grand host sort of thing. So anyway, let's go on. So we're going to be talking about three learning objectives to this particular lecture. The first is to talk about the designer's dilemma, and I think this is the most important bit, and discuss bias in game development. Like, where does this come from? I think it should be expected because it's a perfectly human reaction to essentially the design process. So we're going to talk a little bit about the design process, but also how these they're called heuristics. How these heuristics, 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 how they feed into like decision-making processes, and these happen all the time. And this actually might be this lecture might be a bit of helpful life advice, because you see them all over the place. Once you start to get into behavioural economics, you start to understand why people behave the way they do. And also, once you start to understand behavioural economics, you realise, how little you are actually in control of your own behavior. Like a lot of what we do as animals, because we are social animals, is essentially socially constructed. Now, as I've said before, I'm a pragmatist. I'm not a constructivist. I don't believe that, perception is reality, for instance. I mean, that's a very extreme version of constructivism, but that I don't believe anywhere near that. I also don't believe there is any that there is a conceptual framework upon which humans can actually understand what the truth is that exists outside of humanity. Because even stuff like physics, I mean, that's based on a lot of our understanding of physics is based on essentially arbitrary numbers that have just been assigned certain values, and an arbitrary mathematical system, largely in for some reason we've decided to go base 10 as like our sort of standard numerical system, but we didn't have to. So a lot of how we understand the universe is actually based on the social. So I think that I'm a pragmatist. I think those discussions are interesting, but I don't really care like about that kind of stuff. That's for other philosophers to argue. I'm not massively bothered by that. Then we're going to talk about the observer effect, which is essentially casual perception bias. So this is essentially people who are active in the community, but perhaps don't compete in tournaments themselves, or perhaps don't play too many games. Perhaps they do a lot more modelling and stuff like that. And essentially how that kind of their perception of the meta kind of feeds into the sort of this coalescing of opinion within the community, the wider community. And then finally, we'll talk about the player's brain and competitive biases. And yes, factions being broken is the fault of competitive players. I 100% believe that it's really, though, it's really the job of competitive players to highlight issues with faction design by breaking them. That they're like the ultimate. It's the ultimate play testing, really. It's somebody trying to make something as broken as possible, and then having a go at it. So it's the same reason that game developers in general actually love other channels like the Spiffing Brit, one of my favourite channels. Nothing to do with the fact that we've pretty much got the same accent and slightly similar mannerisms. I'm not quite as plump of chest as he is, but anyway. But people love, developers in general love that, because these people find the holes in the program, and that's kind of the job of competitive players, which also means it's competitive players. Well, it's not really their fault that the game's broken, but they certainly highlight it and run with it. But anyway, we'll talk about that. That's a bit more nuanced actually than sorry, something just went wrong. So excuse me, I just need to clear my throat. So let's talk about design. How does design work in Warhammer? Traditionally, this is my understanding, I don't know, but traditionally the models came first. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Games Workshop started in the 80s as they used to make models for D&D. So D&D was a thing, and they made models for D&D. And eventually they made lots and lots of models and decided to essentially create a more tabletop version of D&D, because I've never actually played D&D, but I understand, which is, I find weird. I don't know why that's never happened. But perhaps because I'm a bit too competitive, and I end up just min-maxing stuff, and it's just a bit boring. But D&D can function as a tabletop skirmish game. It can function as a, entirely in your head, esoteric roleplay game as well. So, and I've watched D&D games, like, obviously I've watched a few Critical Roles, and, I love that channel, and I love the, what the hell was it called? The Netflix series that came off the back of that. That was Dragon's Dogma, was it? Fantastic. So, but it can function as a so then essentially the chaps who were Games Workshop at the time thought, well, we'll just make our own version, but we want it to be just more battle-y and less role-play, less sort of character. I mean, we want characterful in it, but we want it to be more tabletop because we want big armies. We want eventually to end up having battles. So then they developed essentially the early versions of Warhammer, which then sort of mutated over time until I think about Warhammer, I'd say probably 5th was the first time where you could, in a reasonable time frame, have a massive battle, with like hundreds of troops and stuff like that. And then, that obviously developed more into 6th, and 6th was when you started to really be able to like have proper competitive play. I mean, not that tournaments weren't a thing before that, but it just wasn't. The game was never really designed to be balanced. It was designed to be fun. Rob, I'll have to give props to Rob Symes of Square Based here, because I remember having a conversation with him a while ago, and and he told me Games Workshop never make good games. There's objectively way better game systems out there. What they do make are very fun games, and that they're some of the most fun games that you play. And it's that inherent unbalance that creates a lot of the tension, and a lot of the fun, a lot of the entertainment. So, so I guess if you want a perfectly balanced game, you go play chess, right? But even chess, despite both sides having exactly the same pieces, even chess, white has an advantage. White wins more games than black because white goes first. So we know we know that creating a perfectly balanced game is actually impossible. So, but why does rules creep happen so much in Warhammer in particular? Well, I think firstly because you've got the principle of it's designed to be fun, right? Fun is number one. Engagement, getting people to play the thing, and therefore collect the models and tell stories within a grand battle rule set. That's what they're aiming for, really. They're not massively aiming for anything else. And and then the models come first. So essentially, the developers of the models nowadays, somebody draws a piece of artwork, that then goes to the CAD designers, the CAD team, who then make a 3D render of that, and then that goes to essentially the sculptors, as far as I understand, who then break down that 3D render into, essentially turn it into a sprue so it can go into an injection mold, and then it's tested and it goes backwards and forwards, and then eventually they get a working mold, and then they produce it and sell it. And then it gets painted, and not fairly early on, but not massively early on, the games designers and the fiction writers and all that, this huge team get to see like the concept art and the 3D render, and then they start to sort of craft rules around that stuff. So we know that they've been aware of Cathay for ages. So it's perfectly possible that the rules for Cathay were written at the same time as the rules for everything else. Like, people are, I hear said that essentially Cathay's rules were written, with the new 1.5 errata in mind. I think they might have been revised, but I get a sneaking suspicion that somebody had written those rules for Cathay ages ago. And rather than Cathay having everybody else's cool stuff, actually the rules that they've written for Cathay they've given to other So for instance, the cannon turning off Swift Stride, I could well conceive of somebody when they were just scratching down notes on all the factions, when they were designing the whole of the game, they might have had that rule to one side for Cathay's Grand Cannons, and then thought, well, actually we could give it to the Dreadquake Mortar because that's pretty cool. That'll help. So it's perfectly. But now, I understand that the Dreadquake Mortar has always had a movement debuff effect alongside its damage. So that's probably a poor example, but you get the point I'm trying to make here. Anyway, So let's talk about these biases, and then you'll start to see them. So Novelty Biosaur feature creep. I'm just going to keep referring because I've got papers and stuff on this screen, so I can talk about what's going on. So Novelty Biosaur feature creep is essentially that designers overinflate the new factions with mechanics to make them feel fresh, worth buying, make them feel new. They want, from what we see, they seem to want as much variety in terms of list writing between factions as possible. In fact, you look at the within factions, so the sub factions, they are all quite different in makeup to the main Grand Army sort of list. So they're sufficiently. So it seems like they want a lot of variety, within faction as well as between faction, which is, I think, really interesting as a sort of from a game balance perspective, because they want everything to feel different and unique, but they also want to preserve a sense of balance within the game, so it remains fun to play. So this novelty bias. So for instance, Norman and Berm, two different papers, 88 and 81 respectively, came up with this concept of novelty bias, and they were looking at in the 80s, looking at software development and design principles. In that, essentially, when designers design new things, they always do this. They want the new thing to feel worth buying. So it needs to have a new special thing about it. And that doesn't lead to an entire faction being OP. For instance, if you look at Bretonia, some new models came out. They weren't additionally overpowered over Bretonia in general. I mean, Bretonia is pretty overpowered, which hence the Pegasus Knights being on the front cover of this presentation. But but when they released the Arcane Journal, there was a wizard in there, Lady Elise Ducat, and she I think she's really good, but she's not overpowered. She doesn't. You look at her rule set, you think, oh, that's pretty good, that's pretty handy. Yeah, I could see that featuring in an army, a sort of a fairly knight heavy army, but I could see that featuring in an army because, for instance, you put her in a unit of errantry knights, you can get them a 6 or maybe even a 5 up regen. Strength 6, AP 3 lances. That's pretty good. By giving her the 2 Bretonia signature spells, because she can take 2 of them. Plus she's got an extra mechanic, which means that she's better at dispelling than everybody else in the game, pretty much. So she's got game, but she's not overpowered in that, yes, she's cheap for her abilities. The amount of, if you took a high enchantress and gave her all of Elise's abilities, you'd be paying, I think I worked out 60, 70 points more. So, but anyway, all of these new factions are stacked with complex interactions because they want to make it interesting to read and a fun read, and they want you to have fun on the tabletop. So that's just a little thing. As you can see, I've put all these biases in a stack because they do stack. It's like the game Warhammer itself. The features stack to create something that's not so good overall. You've then got, of course, the sunk cost fallacy, which came from Arx and Bloomer in 1985, and their paper, The Psychology of Sunk Cost, which was essentially a piece of research where they oh, there's my boy outside the window. Where they see, and now my wife is at the window. Where they looked at, I can't remember exactly what they did, but they essentially looked at whether people would chase dead money or that was it. It was ski trips, wasn't it? So participants were asked to imagine buying 2 ski trips, but could only attend one. So, imagine you're in a situation where you've bought a couple of ski trips, but for whatever reason, you've got to choose between the two. There's and now imagine one of those trips is lower quality. So, let's say they're both at the same ski resort. One of them is like 5 days in a 3-star hotel that cost you £2,000, and another is in a 5-star hotel that costs you £500, right? Something like that. Most people would choose the £2,000 one because they don't want to feel like they've wasted £2,000. Now, in reality, the logical thing to say would be, well, look, I've paid £2,500 for this ski trip, because I can only attend one, so I've paid £2,500 regardless. Like, I don't, that's the cost of this weekend, whichever one I attend. So obviously, I'm going to go for the 5-star hotel. Duh. But that's not what people actually do. People go for the, oh, well, yeah, but £2,000, I've only wasted £500 if I go on the £2,000 one. So I'll do that because I wouldn't want to, probably, although it's 3-star, it's probably in a better location and the parking might be, and people start to justify making essentially what is an illogical decision based on other things. And this is what heuristics all are. It's how people are consistently illogical. So the sunk cost fallacy is a thing. So because you've spent a lot of time developing it, you've got to make it good. You've got to make it good so it sells and so your work is a success, right? And if you don't do that, so that means chasing sometimes good money after, or throwing good money after bad. So that's at play a little bit of a contributory factor to essentially why they have to justify these models being so good, or why in their minds they're justifying these models being better because they have to make them good. Now, the coolness or the sort of the aesthetic bias is what I should have put here, sorry, rather than coolness or fantasy. But it's the aesthetic bias, which is, there's a couple of papers. Thorndike from 1920, which is a paper which sort of originated the so-called halo effect. The paper was called A Constant Error in Psychological Ratings, where they showed people like a kind of a guess who board, if I'm remembering the right paper, where they showed people a kind of a guess who board and asked them to pick who they thought the most intelligent would be, or who do you think would be the best at football, or who do you think would be the best at chess, or that kind of stuff. And there was, in terms of positive achievement, that attractiveness and positive achievement were very closely linked. So weirdly, the most attractive people weren't given academic domains in general. They were given sporty domains, but they were always perceived to be better than the people who didn't look quite as, even stuff I don't think chess was one of the questions, but even stuff like that, attractiveness made people think that they were better. And then Traktinsky et al. In 2000 wrote a paper called What is Beautiful is Usable, which was a paper that essentially, I can't remember what the study was, but users perceive of a system that's more attractive as being more functional regardless of actual usability. And I bet you see this all the time at your place of work, in that people will buy systems for other people to use that have been really nicely designed, they've got all nice buttons and all that kind of stuff, regardless sometimes of whether it actually does the fucking job you want it to do. I see it all the time in financial services in that people say, oh yeah, I like this particular investment platform. Why? Oh, it's so easy to use. But then you scratch the surface a little bit and you realise, well, actually, this platform over here, which is terrible to use because it's so badly designed, is actually probably the best in terms of like what it offers and the service and all the rest. So, there is this kind of this aesthetic bias in that essentially with Cathay, you've got some really nice new models and they look really cool. The balloon in particular is cool. It's huge as well. It's a massive model. It's a really nice model. Like, yeah, if I probably would buy a balloon army because they do look cool. I like the concept of like balloons and cavalry. Like, I just like that as a concept. Like, the infantry are really good, and they're also quite cool. Like, the models are all cool, right? So there is this kind of heuristic at play within the designers, because they are humans, who, they're like, Miao Ying's so cool. Look at this model. It's so great. Somebody said it looks like Raya and the Lost Dragon, which is like, yeah, she does actually a bit. Yeah. Or sorry, I think their daughter said that model's cool. It looks like Raya and the Last Dragon, which is, it does. It's got that very kind of friendly Eastern Oriental kind of dragony feel about it. So they've given it loads of cool rules that kind of reflect what it looks like, including stuff like, for instance, stubborn and Magic Res 1. Like, those two rules it doesn't need, but they've given it anyway. Because, they don't want you to not be able to use your cool new thing, right? So they've given it, so that's literally aesthetic bias in play, in that it looks cool, so we're going to give it some stuff that it shouldn't have. Because basically, if you didn't give her stubborn and she got hit and magically out combat resed, and then she could flee and then get ridden down without really doing anything, right? So you got to give her stubborn to give her at least a couple of rounds of combat. That's what stubborn does, right? And for some units, any kind of like guard style units like blackguards or Phoenix, whatever they're called, or Eternal Guards, or that kind of stuff. It makes sense giving them stubborn because they're not likely to break instantly. That's kind of what stubborn does. But, it's perfectly plausible that something big could smash into a dragon and push it back and overrun it. Because remember, like, fleeing doesn't mean fleeing. Fleeing just means push. Like, if you look at a shield wall, you've got your two lines both pushing at each other, and if one crumbles and over, they've got to run. They've got no choice. They're all going to be, they've got to get out there and form up again over here. So, anyway, and then you've got this kind of playtest confirmation bias. Which is basically it. So I'm talking about confirmation bias in that. Now I'm not saying the playtesters aren't highly skilled. What I am saying is that if you're in a little bubble of a few people who are playtesting a concept, right, you're less likely, because of essentially how groupthink works, but you're less likely to. You're less like. Sorry, my dog is really annoying me because she's decided to. Anyway, so you're less. What was I talking about? Oh yes, confirmation bias. So confirmation bias. There's loads and loads of papers about confirmation bias, but what might be at play is playtesters are selectively attending to data that supports their beliefs, particularly maybe the designers. So, they might say things like, so the playtesters might say, oh, we don't like this is broken. And they go, oh, no, it's fine. No, you're just like power gamey playtesters. So, obviously you're going to do that. But I mean, people won't, because, the people won't read. Do you know what I mean? You get that kind of dismissal. Sorry, I'm just going to boot the dog out of the room. Look, do you want to go out? Why did you stay in? Right. Yes. So I think all of these biases, you know, which, like I said, they stack, which is why I've presented them in a stack, all coalesce to occasionally create things that are broken. And I think in particular that was at play with high elves, because like high elves have always been the broken faction, right? Since, you know, I remember when the high elf book came out in 6th, and they were just absolutely, I mean, they were one of the reasons that a lot of factions started banning named characters, because Tyrion was just horrendous. Like, he did a lot of damage, but also he was impossible to kill. So he had like, what did he have? It was like a 1-up or a 2-up armor save. He had a ward save of 4+ or 5+, something like that. He had, what, 3 or 4 wounds at toughness 3. But you like he was like, was he like -1 to hit because he's such a skilled swordsman? If you missed, he had this like riposte attack. So like if you missed him, he got to make a bonus attack. He also had this thing that brought him back to life with 1 wound. So if you did all, and also when so his ward save went up to a 2-up when he was on his last wound. So, you know, you hit him a few times and he's on a 2-up ward, and then he comes back to life when you kill him on 1 wound, still up with a 2-up ward save. He was just an absolute nightmare. The amount of times, I had a friend who had high elves, and I played him with Chaos a lot. And the amount of times, like, I think that, you know, I was talking to somebody about my Skaven army. I had a Skaven army in 6th, and I think I lost like 4 games. One A tournament with it. I didn't really compete very much because I didn't have a car, couldn't travel, young, blah blah blah. But the one game I lost was against a bloke with a high elf list, and he had bloody Tyrion. And like literally, I killed everything else in his army, and I had about 2 turns of everything in my army shooting at this bloody Tyrion, and he just didn't die. And the victory condition was like he had to kill my general, and I had to kill his. And if the general was, whoever killed the other one general, if their general survived, they automatically won, and that was it. Tyrion was obviously his general. You know, he even charged Tyrion into a big block of clan rats with a bell. You know, and this was unlucky on my part because I still remember this. I don't know why I remember this game in particular, but he did like maximum wounds to, you know, I challenged him out because I didn't want him killing a load of rats, so I thought I'll let him kill off the champion. So, and you know, he was on his own at this point because he had come with a load of dragon princes that I'd shot off the table with like 1 turn of fire from about half my army. Skaven were really good. Yeah, then he charged in, did maximum overkill. I needed to, I think, because of leadership modifiers and stuff, I needed to pass a leadership test on like an 8, and I had a reroll. Failed that. He overran and caught me, and 1 model destroyed an entire unit in pursuit. I still think there ought to be some rules about that, really, but like you need to have enough models to like capture your opponents, but or run them down or something. So yeah, and then that was it. And then I had like 2 turns of basically shooting the ever living crap out of him, and he just didn't die. So that bloke won the game, even though I other than Tyrion, I tabled him. So anyway, high elves were like, have always been like the broken faction, right? You saw that when they brought them into Age of Sigmar with Lumineth. They were tremendously broken when they were brought out. And again, all of these biases were in play, in that they had Severeth, who had new abilities like the Hurricanes that could pop around the battlefield, which I never thought was a problem, but you know, the community had a massive problem with it, and we'll come back to that in a sec. Like I played against some lists with them in, and you know, it just wasn't really a problem. So yeah, I mean, all of these biases are normally in play, but when they released the high elves this time, it's almost as if they went, you know what, lads, this time should we just balance high elves with everybody else and just make them okay, make them pretty good but not broken. So I don't know what's going on there. Like maybe somebody's left the design team who had a real hard on for high elves, and now that influence is gone. Maybe that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know. The next thing to talk about is that's not a very good slide, is it? I thought it looked better than that. So there's three sort of observer effects. So we've talked about essentially the design bias. So what about essentially the wider community? I Now I have been using ChatGPT to help me a little bit with this. It's going okay, but it gets stuff wrong sometimes. That's yeah, that's all right. So the bandwagon effect came from Cialdini in 1984 with his paper "Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion," which is it asked it's a bit of a silly one, but like what they found was if you put up a sign in hotel rooms that says most people reuse their towels, please help us, save water and all the rest. This was in the 80s, of course, so the decade of excess, really. Most people would then reuse towels, whereas most people don't. Most people don't when not told that. Even if you make it harder for them to get a new towel. So, if you put a new towel like in a really difficult, hard to reach place, most people will still go for a new towel rather than reuse the towel. The thing that makes people reuse towels is a little sign. Now, the UK government did this a bit ago, and that massively increased the uptake of corporation tax. Because they started sending out letters saying most people pay their corporation tax within 22 days or whatever it is. Now, the number was a lie, but the point is they wanted people paying within a month. So they said most people pay on average within 22 days. And they picked like a weird number that there's a reason for. It wasn't 22 actually, was it? But there's a reason for the number. Was it like 17 or something like that? Because of how people perceive numbers. So they picked on that, and that massively increased the velocity at which people actually paid their corporation tax bill. So we know this is a thing. So essentially, if people in the community start saying things, then everybody in that community starts to believe it, to a greater or a lesser extent. So I think we've got to be really careful in saying that this is a problem, that's a problem, which is why when I'm looking at the data, I try to be as tentative as possible when it comes to saying something is overpowered or not. I don't like being conclusive without conclusive proof, and that's because of this bandwagon effect. In that I don't just want to be jumping onto a bandwagon and ending up being wrong because I haven't done enough analysis in order to ensure my conclusions are robust. I know that's a bit boring, but hey, that's me, I'm afraid. I'm just a bit boring, I guess. Base rate neglect. So this is an effect. Yes, this is a really good paper. So Kahneman and Tversky, well, to me anyway, everybody else probably finds it a bit boring. Kahneman and Tversky, big names in the sort of the behavioural economic world. In 1972, published a paper called "Subjective Probability: A Judgment of Representativeness." So essentially, how the experiment worked was that participants were told that there's a room full of 100 lawyers, 100 people. 70 of them are lawyers and 30 of them are engineers, right? And then they were asked, this person is and his part in his yeah, this person for an additional part-time job invents things or something like that. That wasn't one of the examples, but anyway, whatever. But they were asked that sort of question, and inventiveness associated with engineering. So people go, "Oh, that's the engineer, isn't it?" Obviously, but the base rate effect is, well, no. That lawyers are 70% of the people in the room. You should always pick lawyer because you way more likely of being true. Like, just because somebody's a lawyer doesn't mean they aren't inventive. Like, this person plays chess. Like, you might go for the lawyer rather than the engineer, but why? Well, I mean, yeah, that would make sense because I've just said you should always go for the lawyer, but you might go for the lawyer because of it might be more associated with or this person works in construction. So people might go engineer, but actually, lawyers work in construction as well. People buy and sell houses all the time. So lawyers are an important part of the whole process, really, and signing contracts and all that kind of stuff. Like big construction firms have in-house lawyers, of course. So um, so a lot of people, they look at, and this is why I'm so glad Colin of Old World Rankings has done that normal range bit, because if you just look at the base rate in isolation, it tells you very little, especially in this context. So if you just look at the win percentage, it's not really telling you a lot. Whereas the range of normal, it tells you an awful lot about where most results are sitting at the moment. So looking at the wrong base rate, or perhaps overemphasizing the effect of a base rate, is also a sort of form of this neglect. And then finally, the halo effect, which is a bit like aesthetic bias, but the halo effect. Yeah, I'd say the halo effect and aesthetic bias are probably... Yeah. So the halo effect is that aesthetic bias, but it works the other way in that, you look at models that are cool and seem to have cool rules, so people assume that they're good. I do that all the time. I'm a massive sucker for the halo effect. Like, I look at a cool thing and I'm like, I really want that to be good because I really want to buy it because the model looks great. And then I justify buying a thing that I've just bought because it looks cool, and then realise when I get it to a tournament, it's total nesh. And yeah, so I'm definitely one for that. That's a flaw that I've yet to wring out. But yeah, so essentially you have these sort of perception biases, which are essentially which come from people in the community that aren't, as active in terms of like the gaming and stuff. But there are a lot of people who just paint and hobby, and make dioramas and stuff. So this more sometimes applies to them, but sometimes applies to like people who play games as well. What more applies to people who play games is competitive. Is these three biases, I think. Oh. I think I've misstated the availability heuristic there a little bit. Where are my notes on? Let's ask ChatGPT. Can you get me some references, and let's see if it gets the right ones. Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah, that's all correct. That's also correct. Yeah, cool. This got stuff right. So the availability heuristic, again, Kahneman and Tversky, I've mentioned them again, 1973, wrote a paper called Availability, a heuristic for judging frequency and probability. And this was quite a simple test in that participants were asked to whether English words are more likely to begin with the letter K or have K as the third letter. And most people guessed that there's more words: king, koala, uh, kick, night. um, you know, most people guess that the first letter. In fact, it's not true. There's more. You know, with the third, like ankle, K very commonly comes up as the third letter in words. Arc, ank. I'm just trying to think of words that begin with A. Ankylosaur. Can't think of anything else that begins with A. Baklava? Or was that C? Could be a C, couldn't it? I can't remember. Bokken? Bic is just a word, isn't it? I think just B-I-K. Because I think we call pens Bics now, even though it was a brand. I think it's now the same. Anyway, but you know, so people get stuff wrong because it's essentially what they can recall. So there's a kind of, and that kind of taps into a little bit about recency bias, in that essentially people judge frequency based on their ability to remember stuff, rather than actually rather than statistics. So people rely on this heuristic to sort of I can recall more words that begin. I mean, the real answer to that kind of question to anybody, unless they know, is I haven't got a clue. If somebody asked me that question, well, I know the answer because I've read the paper. But if somebody said to me, I don't know, do more words begin with the letter L or have the letter L as the fourth letter, I'd maybe guess the fourth letter. I don't know, but I mean, I have no idea. Like it'd be a total guess. It'd be like flipping a coin and going with that. Do you know what I mean? Like that's the proper answer, because you don't know, and it's not unless you've actually counted them. It's not really possible to know. Unless somebody's actually done the work and gone through every single word in the dictionary and checked it out. So essentially, you'll see quite a lot of Cathay in like Reddit threads. People are talking about it a lot. I'm doing a whole video on why Cathay happens. And so you might be more inclined to believe that it's broken, or even more broken than it is. And I think that's a key takeaway here. More broken than it is, because people are constantly talking about how broken it is. That doesn't mean it's incredibly broken. Actually, I don't think fixing it is much of a problem. It's not that difficult. But I mean, and obviously you add 100 points to Meow Ying, probably. What do you do? You make the Celestial Dragon Guard upgrade 3 points a model. You with the balloon reduce it to 5 wounds, let's say, and or perhaps even 4 or 5 wounds. And I think the Sentinel's fine, apart from the Jade one. I'd make that with a bound level of 2, not 3. And what else do you need to fix? The Ogre loaders need to be, I'd suggest a 60, 70 point upgrade rather than 35. And I think if you did all that, then Cathay would be fine. To be honest, it's not that difficult a fix. Like, we can identify the bits that are broken and provide, like, you don't want to take away the cool stuff from the balloons, but also giving it 7 wounds means that you can't really, unless you've got a huge amount of DPS, you can't really take it down in one turn of combat, which is a problem, because then it gets to do its cool thing. You want to make its ability to do its cool thing to be a bit harder to pull off, I think. But anyway, so confirmation bias. We've talked a little bit like this. Now, I thought it was Watson, but they're saying Wason, 1960, on the failure to eliminate hypotheses in a conceptual task. So participants were shown a sequence like 246 or 369, and were asked to guess the rule. So given 2, 4, 6, they would commonly go for, well, it's probably increasing in twos, isn't it? That's the rule here. And there is something about pattern recognition here. But, you know, the rule 2, 4, 6 could just be the numbers increasing in value. So you could go 7 next. Or you could go, you know, 8. Or, you know, you could go 12. It doesn't really matter. If the rule is just the last number has to be more than the first, it doesn't have to go up in twos just because every number has already gone up in twos, right? You don't know the pattern, right? So people essentially propose number sequences like 8, 10, 12 because that confirms their suspicion, rather than essentially testing to see, you know, once you've got a hypothesis, what you should do is try and disprove it, which is why in academia we have this concept of the null hypothesis, which is essentially when you're doing any research at all, you have to start with a null hypothesis, which is essentially that, you know, so I would start off with a hypothesis of Cathay is not broken, and then I have a hypothesis that I can then attempt to disprove. So actually, what you can't actually say anything positive, but you can say something's not true. So so for instance, if you start off with a null hypothesis of Cathay is not broken, you can say, well, it's not broken. We don't know whether it is broken or not because actually no, don't because that. We don't know whether it is broken or not, but we know that it's definitely not broken. So, which is a bit of a weird way of coming at it, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it logically. In that, the problem with a sort of a confirmation bias is, you know, you're searching for the conclusion from. Now, you don't actually have to have a null hypothesis. There are various sort of research methods, like what's it called? Grounded theory, the grounded method, where you basically start off with the data and then try and draw conclusions from there and then work your way backwards through the literature to find the conceptual framework that you've employed to, which is it's not really that straightforward, but it's a kind of a more of an iterative process than, which essentially is just sort of going. Iteration is where you sort of take a guess and see how close you are, and then you take another guess and see how close you are, and if that's closer, that's better. You know, basically, a bit like ranging on ships. In that, essentially, ships they fire some cannon a bit long and some cannon a bit short, and they try and get a range of distances, and then the few that hit, that's the range for all of them next time, right? So that gives you your range. But then you kind of, you know, long short until you eventually hit the target. Battleships. If you played the game Battleships, that's an iterative game. So anyway, grounded theory is a bit more iterative than a traditional paper, sort of. But yeah, so confirmation bias. So, and we are seeing a lot of this, like people saying, "Oh, I had a game against Cathay, they're totally broken. I couldn't do anything." And I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm not saying that those stories aren't true, but the fact is that people are sharing them and they're not statistically valid. It's just an anecdote, right? So yeah, that's terrible that you had a terrible game against them. But, you know, and I've done this myself. You know, I've on occasion fallen for it, and then, you know, especially against vampire counts, because I had a really horrendous game against vampire counts, and so. After that, I concluded that they were totally broken, or at least the screen was. But actually, you know, was it that much of a problem? Really? Could I have won that game had I been a bit smarter? Yeah, yeah, I could have done. Like, that wasn't the thing that killed me. I was just intimidated by the rule, and you know. So actually, looking back, when I say I had a terrible game, I did have a terrible game. I was rubbish. And negativity bias, of course, which is essentially... no, that's not the seminal paper. That was earlier. loss aversion. Yeah, it's kind of anyway. So negativity bias is essentially that a negative So we've all heard the anecdote that one bad review, 20 people read one bad review, and only 3 people read a good review, right? So so bad reviews have much more of an impact than good reviews. In terms of like performance evaluations or Google ratings or reviews on there or stuff like that. So just because you've had a bad day against a particular list doesn't mean everybody taking that list is broken, right? And we know that the people who have Cathay at the moment have more time and money. They're probably a bit more competitive, because buying a new faction is expensive. If you're buying a 2,000 list just on spec, as it were, then it is expensive. So the people who are taking them at the moment are they're not building up their army list slowly from stuff that's maybe a bit suboptimal because they're buying the units because they think they're quite cool. So we don't really know. We've not really got many results, for Cathay. So we don't know that they're broken, but early doors, it's looking pretty bad. We'll only know once we get a sufficient number of results from a sufficiently varied set of people. So it's not just like 3 or 4 players, but like, a few hundred results from like 100 or so players. Then we'll know how it's doing as an overall faction, right? But at the moment, the people who are playing it are a bit better resourced and have a bit more time on their hands. So, they're likely to be doing better. That sort of type of. So it's so that kind of negativity bias. So everybody going on about how broken they are, blah 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 blah. Yeah, I think we've we've got to let the dust settle quite a lot more before we start writing off the faction, I think. But so my conclusion is that essentially that because of all these heuristics, there is like a design drift in that, like I said before, these biases, they all stack. You've got aesthetic bias, you've got sunk cost, you've got this kind of this novelty bias, as it were. You've got feature creep, correction bias released after a dud. I put that in there because I was going to do another slide on high elves, actually, which I took out, but I didn't take out that thing. But basically, like high elves, from what I can tell, was a bit of a dud. Like it was a bit of a non-event. Like it didn't really move the needle for high elves. I mean, Crace is good because of the new errata, but like I think an infantry heavy high elf list would be quite good in the current meta, to be honest. Although that said, so is a cavalry heavy list. Somebody put in the comments, and again this is an anecdote, but you had a cavalry heavy list playing against an infantry heavy list, and the cavalry heavy list won despite losing its dragon early doors. But that was essentially due to maneuverability, and your man with the cav list was obviously just a bit better at deploying his forces and wielding the space available on the tabletop. So maneuverability. That's another video I'm going to do, like why moving is how you win, at some point. But so I think all these biases, they stack. They all stack up, and that's how Cathay happens. Because the design principle, so you've got this really new cool set of models, right? The company spent a lot of money on it. It's the first. They're doing a new release well ahead of schedule in this new faction that they've never ever had before. There's a lot of risk on it. Not only for Cathay, but it puts a lot of jeopardy on the whole Warhammer project. So it needs to sell and it needs to be good. We spent a lot of money on this, so on and so forth, and that creeps into the designers' perspectives, then you've got the playtesters probably going, oh, this is all a bit cheap, like, and the designers are like, yeah, but we like all the rules, they're really cool, the models are going to sell like hotcakes, and also, like, you know, it's probably fine. It's probably just you're just power gamers, and you know that's probably once it hits the wider community, you know, which is why they don't like. Often they don't knee jerk. Oh, I've annoyingly picked a spot under my eye, so I think I'm bleeding a little bit. Idiot. Yeah, so all of these things like factor in and coalesce into like the new thing being totally broke. Which is why I think, like, if you think about it, if you go back to, for instance, the first release of the Slaves to Darkness book, I think they were the last faction to get a battle tome in Age of Sigmar, right? They were bottom of the meta, you know, absolutely terrible. And, you know, they then got their release, they then got their book, and it shifted the needle hardly at all. Like, they weren't any good. Like, I had slaves. I'd been finishing bottom of tournaments for ages, trying to represent this faction and trying to sort of prove that it wasn't as bad as people said it was, and it was. I had lots of kickings to prove that, and then they released the battle tome, and then it was like, oh, they're just a little bit better. Like, I don't even think they're mid-table now. So then, you know, my next few tournament results, I got pretty decent, got above mid-table, but, like, you know, then I started switching faction because I'm like, oh, I'm waiting for my book, because every time a book came out, they had some broken mechanics in, and the slaves are out, and they don't. Oh, that's annoying. And that's kind of, you know, that kind of, I think that's kind of what happened with High Elves a little bit, really. I think I was getting really excited about, like, what broken stuff they were going to do with them. And I think as well, like, I wouldn't be offended if they made High Elves broken. Because, like, that's just, like, that feels like tradition. But, you know, whatever. Right. I think that's all I want to say on this particular subject. I've been going on for about an hour. Again, if you've got this far and you've not subscribed, you should probably do that, because, you know, if you've got this far. And if you've liked the video, there's a button that allows you to express that. Comment down below. I respond to all comments. I am responding to all comments so far. I don't think I've missed any. Although YouTube's changed the comments tab, it's now the community tab, and it works a bit differently, I think. Like, sometimes comments don't come up on that, so I don't always get notified, basically. So sometimes I might be a bit late, but I do try and talk to everybody. So, you know, if you got, I'm really interested, and I do that because I'm really interested in your opinions. Like, I'm as much as part of this community as you are. So, you know, talk to me, please. That was weird. Don't do that again. Yeah, I guess just say bye now. Toodaloo. Oh no, my mouse is broken. My mouse is broken. I can't find the stop button. Anyway, bye.